Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I can do this with the mic, right? You to actually be part of the crowd participation now, so that's fun. It's a pleasure to be here as I get the PowerPoint going and to get to talk to you about the future of education and the role that technology, I think, plays in fueling really a transformation of our education system from its roots in a factory model era system into a student-centered one that can serve every single child well, as we're pulling this up, right? There we go. Cool. Let's go ahead and click on the bottom there. No problem. May get it or not. There we go. So, and certainly excited to talk about blended learning itself. I know you also heard from my colleague at the Christensen Institute, Horace Dedew, last year at this conference. So I'm going to try to refrain from some of the conversation around disruptive innovation itself. We'll go there, but what I really want to talk about before even hitting on the topic for my book, Blended, is really a bigger landscape in which we enter right now for education, which is that I think we're standing at right now at a time where technology is coming together with a policy framework nationally that really allows us to rethink what should schooling look like. And I want to make sure that as you all go back to your districts and you think about how we serve students and you work with teachers and principals at schools to serve students well, we think about this bigger picture and this bigger opportunity right now. From my standpoint, when online learning emerged a couple decades ago now, that was the first inroads and opportunity in this big opportunity to innovate. And when online learning emerged in 2008, we wrote the book Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns with Clayton Christensen. And in that book, we made this crazy prediction that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. In 2008, when that prediction came out, everyone thought we were dead crazy. I remember being in Salem at a hearing in 2009 and legislators just rolling their eyes when I said it. They just didn't believe that public schools could innovate that quickly. And yet, a decade later almost after that prediction, increasingly people think that's well within bounds. And what they're seeing is that the opportunity that online learning is giving them is not about online learning itself. It's not about the technology, but it's really about the why. Why innovate? And this, from my standpoint, the reason to do this is so that every student can succeed. And the big policy context that now has come together in the last year is that the No Child Left Behind era has sunset. And in the end of last year in December, signed into law was the Every Student Succeeds Act, which really transforms the framework in which public schools can operate. To rethink what should outcomes look like for students, what should accountability and transparency within states look like, and it really empowers the local states and districts to think about these metrics and to rethink the fundamental arrangements that education has always governed by to realize great outcomes for every student. So my sense is that with online learning really maturing right now and getting much better and accelerating its growth, combined with this policy framework, we're standing right now in sort of a 2-year window maybe, where we can really take some big steps to transform education in ways that we've really haven't had this opportunity in at least 2 or 3 generations. Now, what online learning makes possible at scale, I think, is 3 things. The first thing is that it's clear that the majority of online learning is growing inside of schools in what we call blended learning environments. It makes blended learning, all schools, able to move to blended learning at scale. And when I say the word blended learning, what I mean is, and I'm going to put up a technical definition here, is 3 parts. The first part is it's a formal education program in which a student is learning at least in part through online learning, where they have some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and/or the pace of learning. Simplified, right? It's online learning with that shift in instructional model so that there's some element of control
from the student's perspective. The second part is that it's got to be at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home. That's fancy speak for schools with teachers. And then the third part is that the modalities along each student's learning path within a given course or subject or domain, they have to be connected in some way. So what I mean by that is in the 1980s, when teachers were sending me out of the classroom to do Oregon Trail for 20 minutes, people remember Oregon Trail? Come on, come on. All right, so that was not blended learning, right? The number of squirrels that I killed on my way on the Oregon Trail had nothing to do with the math lesson that I was doing, nothing to do with the reading assignment and so forth, okay? They have to be connected in some way. What you do online has to inform what you're doing offline and vice versa, okay? Now, importantly, that means we're not just talking about technology in education when we're saying blended learning, right? Just simply putting an electronic whiteboard in front of students and beaming online curriculum at them, not blended learning, right? And the reason is it hasn't shifted that pedagogical model. We haven't changed the element of student control over their time, the place, the path, or the pace of learning. Similarly, just because we have one-to-one laptops or digital textbooks doesn't mean we're doing blended learning either. These things can be important enablers of blended learning, but just the mere presence of them doesn't mean you're doing it. Now, importantly, not all blended learning is good. I don't want to equate blended learning with always being good. We can go around the country, the states, and see great blended learning models, and we can see some terrible ones. But I think what should excite us about it is really two things. Blending makes possible personalization at scale. And this is really important because every student has different learning needs at different times. Some children pick up material really quickly. Other children struggle to learn something. They just have to grapple with it much longer to really let it cement and dig in and for them to understand. And the reason that we all have these different learning needs at different times is quite literally the working memory capacities that we all have, aptitudes in the front of our brain to absorb oral and visual information is different. We all have different capacities around this. And cognitive scientists also know that we all have different long-term memory. Fancy speak basically for background knowledge. We all bring different experiences, background knowledge into a learning experience. And what that means is that if I sit here talking about disruptive innovation, for example, and that's a phrase that's unfamiliar to you, the human brain naturally gloms on to the unfamiliar, tries to wrestle with it, maybe develops a misconception about it, even as the point of the lesson just continues on, and it actually doesn't, it's not really that relevant to what the teacher is trying to teach an individual student about. Because of all this, personalization is absolutely critical if every child is going to be successful, okay? And the problem, though, is that our education system, when it was fashioned in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was literally modeled after factories to standardize the way we teach and test, which is the exact opposite of personalization. And the cool thing about online learning is by being inherently modular, meaning I can go at my path and pace through material, someone else can go completely differently, that control element, we can actually really start to personalize at scale without needing a tutor for every single child, which is an unbelievably effective way to educate every single student, but also a cost-prohibitive way to do it. And so you can actually see, this is a screenshot from the Khan Academy in a 5th grade classroom in Los Altos, California, school district there, where you actually can see the individual trajectories of these students. And if you were to zoom in on the child highlighted in blue there, what you would have seen on day 0 of the class was he was 3rd from the bottom in his particular math class. And so in a traditional math class, he would have been grouped in the slow group. They would have given it a more humane name than the slow group, like turtles or something. But, and then he would have just sat there for the rest of the year, right? And what turned out was that he actually just had a few misconceptions in his... He had a few misconceptions in his earlier learning, just from 2nd, 3rd grade basic understanding. And those misconceptions had caused him not to be able to understand some concepts in 5th grade mathematics. And with the Khan Academy, he actually dug back into those earlier misconceptions, resolved them, and as he did so, he just started to soar in math. And at the end of this particular screenshot, day 70, he was third from the top in his particular math class, right? So the power to start to individualize, personalize, customize for these different learning needs is quite powerful about what it can do. Now, the second thing I think that of why blending is that it can make competency-based learning possible at scale. Now, when I say competency-based learning, what I'm contrasting it with is the existing system. The existing system is one in which we deliver content to students, we test and assess, students move on to the next grade, subject, body, material, whatever it is, based on the calendar, and then they get their results afterward with no ability to do anything about that. Now, you hear a lot these days about data-driven decision-making in education, right? Tons of conferences talk about this. The funny thing is that the research is unbelievably clear about this. Data used in this type of system where students have no ability to do anything with the data is incredibly demotivating to learning. It turns students off, makes them bored, disaffected, whatever, and causes them to dislike school and want to spend less time there. You contrast this, and sorry, the other thing it does is it obviously causes students to develop holes in their learning, what educators call the Swiss cheese problem, right? And the big problem as a teacher with 30 students in your class is that you know all of those students have holes in their learning, but you have no idea which students have which holes. And the ability to differentiate when the calendar is just ticking by is incredibly challenging. Now you contrast this with a competency-based learning system, where students move on upon mastery. The learning is fixed and the time becomes the variable, so it flips the equation. So we still offer learning experiences to students. We test and assess because testing and assessment is an important part of learning, but now we use that to get real-time or interactive feedback that we use to inform what students do next, and students move on once they've truly mastered a body of material, right? This just makes sense for building learning and makes mastery part of it. And we can do this now at scale with online learning in some pretty exciting ways. And what I've put up here is a definition of what high quality competency-based learning looks like from an organization called Competency Works. Sorry, every time I switch to my left hand, I get this static. But this is a definition that I think is useful for thinking about what does high quality competency-based learning look like. But the part that I want to focus in on, particularly for this audience, given the role that you all have in playing as we move into next generation assessments and computer-based assessments and be thinking about what that world enables, is really that assessment, that third bullet, that assessment is a meaningful and positive learning experience for students. My sense is that we're at a time right now where we can start to think about a very different future for assessments, and rather than thinking of just the summative assessment at the end of a particular course and formative assessments that teachers use in their own ways, we can start to break apart this and look at systems of assessments that are smaller, they're more frequent, and they're both for learning, meaning those formative purposes, and of learning, that summative purpose. In other words, every single assessment you take in a competency-based learning system both helps you understand what you have to do next to master material or what's next in your progression, but it also creates information that can help us see where students are and understand more transparently how a school or student, teacher, whatever the unit of analysis is doing, right? And actually can give us far more information than can summative assessments, which we're always dumbing down and making them the lowest common denominator because we don't want them to be too long, and yet somehow they still manage to take up 2 weeks at the end of a year for testing periods that detract from learning, okay? And my sense is that computer-based assessments can be a huge part of making this shift possible and thinking about a system rather than where every single person sits down for testing during a 2-week window, that testing is much more fluid and part of the learning process. I think will change bandwidth questions on schools, but also create some pretty creative opportunities to be rethinking what we even mean by assessments. We can do evaluation of performance-based, project-based tasks where teachers are inputting information through rubrics and so forth. And a case study from higher education, I think, is deeply instructive about how forward-looking this could go. So there's a university called Western Governors University. How many people have heard of it? Okay, a fair number. So it's an online university, competency-based, right? And what they've done is something pretty clever. They have 2 types of assessments in their mastery-based progressions for all their courses. One type is what they call objective assessments. These are like multiple choice, fill in the blank, right or wrong answers. Computers can score all these, right? You actually free up humans from having to spend time on this. This allows them to spend a lot more time also on a second type of assessment, which is a performance-based assessment. Basically a task of what can you actually do with the knowledge and actually demonstrate it in a rich way, in a project, a simulation, whatever it might be. And then what they do actually is that they rather than have a student's own teacher grade the performance-based assessment, they have a whole separate faculty whose sole job is to grade performance-based assessments. And this does 2 things. One, it introduces a layer of objectivity in the grading. So a student can no longer say, gee, I didn't pass that or master that because my teacher hated me, right? Or, gee, I passed it because I showed up to class every single day on time and so they liked me, right? But instead, it's totally about your actual performance against a rubric, against that performance task. And the second thing it does, in their case, is allow them to have teachers who are just solely concentrated on how to really assess rich student work in really deep, meaningful ways, and just really get really good at honing their craft on that. Keep that in mind as we move forward in a little bit, okay, on this conversation. The other thing I think this does is it allows us to change what we think about in terms of outcomes for students. So you're probably aware that the ESSA new law really says, hey, what should student outcomes look like? What should we be thinking about? And my sense is that there's no state in the 50 states right now, or District of Columbia, that has a real idea on how they should be thinking about this question. And that really right now we need tons of innovation from the ground up, from individual schools, pilots within districts, going to their state boards of education and saying like, hey, let us try something new around outcomes. But the other piece that I would say is you're hearing a lot right now in the media about the importance of quote unquote non-cognitive skills. Grit, perseverance, student agency, in other words, the ability to own your learning, be a lifelong learner, make decisions for yourself. These are obviously incredibly important outcomes. It's incredibly unclear from the research that's been done so far that there are assessments that should be baked into an accountability framework in any formal way on these things for a lot of reasons, okay? Doesn't seem like a good idea at all. But what I would argue is that unless we switch to a competency-based learning system, we literally cannot realize these goals for the system. And let me just say why, which is that when a student sits in a class, and regardless of the work that he or she does, as long as they get just a minimum passing grade, they move on to the next concept, grade, whatever, we are sending them the clear and unambiguous signal that it does not matter how hard you work, it does not matter your grit or perseverance, you move on in life. And then when we talk about these outcomes, to not connect it to a competency-based learning conversation, I think is a very big mistake. And my sense is that a really high-functioning competency-based learning system would start to embed these things very naturally into the system, because quite literally you do not move on until you have put in the work and actually mastered the concept, the ability to demonstrate the application of knowledge or skill or whatever it might be, okay? And so I think it's very important to be connecting these conversations right now. The last thing I'll say as I pivot into the conversation of how blended learning fits into this is just that as you're doing this work and helping your districts and schools transform and think about the future of learning and where we can go with this, treat it as a design problem. And what I mean by that is that we don't really know the answer of what this should look like at the end of the day. None of us has a perfect idea of what this system should look like and how it should function. We're inventing the future right now. And so treat it as a design problem where you're gonna understand where you're trying to go with it, iterate on these things, learn from it, and then continue to make changes in practice and really work together as a collaborative group to continually improve against the goals that we set out for our students in our schools. And against that framework, the question I want to ask is, will we fulfill the potential of this moment? And I think there are some encouraging signs. A lot of our friends here in the audience, the vendors, are introducing products that are improving every single day, whether it's more engaging content, the ability to communicate in real time across virtual classrooms through a whole bunch of platforms that exist and do things that we just never thought were possible 10, 15 years ago. I mean, if you went back a decade ago, how many people used AOL Instant Messenger to chat? Come on, like, I worked at AOL, you can insult me. Right? And so it's like we're ashamed of it now. How many of you ever clicked the video chat button on an AOL Instant Messenger? You did, yeah. Did it work? Not really, yeah. It might have crashed your computer, for which I apologize. But the the ability to chat, I mean, ubiquitously with anyone, anywhere in the world for virtually free now. It's amazing how much this stuff is improving. Adaptive learning pathways and content coming out that offer data to help improve recommendations of what students do next, help educators improve what they do next with students. It's just fascinating. So there's some really good news. And then there's the big question of, will we fulfill the potential of the moment? And again, I actually think bigger than the technology is what all of us and all the educators you work with on a daily basis do. And what I would recommend is that you launch into really a design process to tackle this problem. And so I want to walk through the one that we basically outline in the book Blended, and sort of give you a Cliff Notes version of how we tackle that. And I'm going to do it with the frame of how you design a blended learning environment. But what I'd love you to take away from it is that this is a process that doesn't just have to apply to blended learning. It can apply to any set of problems that you're solving around improving schools and really reinventing them for the world in which we now live, with the expectations we now have for them and for students. And the first part of that is do not start with the technology, right? Do not start with the technology for its own sake. Start with what you're trying to accomplish. We say choose a smart rallying cry. What I mean by that, I'll put all this up, is what are the problems that you're trying to solve, the goals that you're trying to achieve, the opportunities that you are trying to seize. Some of these are what we would call core problems. We want to provide high school teachers more time to, say, give rich feedback on writing assignments. We want to boost academic reading results. Some of these might be non-consumption problems, areas outside of the core where we want to offer learning experiences, but for some reason cannot, having to do with budgets, available teachers, schedules, whatever it might be. So lack specific subject matter teachers. We want to help students recover credits so that they can graduate on time, etc. Identify these meaty problems that you're trying to solve, and then state what success would look like in what we would say a smart way, meaning it's specific, it's measurable, it's assignable or achievable, it's realistic, and it's time-bound. So an example might be, our goal is to raise math performance by the end of the 2014-15 school year by 10 percentage points. One example, doesn't have to be a test score-based one. It could be we want to improve the opportunity for teachers to give rich feedback on writing assignments by 1 hour each week. Create that much more time without asking them to work that much harder on what they're currently doing. Really start with that problem and grapple with it of what are we trying to solve. Make it as meaty or not as you want to start with, and define it very specifically so that we all have a clear outcome in mind and a sense to benchmark ourselves against and drive consensus about whether we're actually meeting that goal or not, okay? And then from there, I say organize the team. And when I say organize the team, what I mean is I find that a lot of education technology conferences, people just say, add technology, mix in PD, stir, and everything works great. And some laughter suggests that people know that doesn't make much sense. But my sense is that before we think about professional development and things of that nature, we really have to think about what's the actual design we're going to put in place. And to get to a design, we need to think about who's the team we need to have at the table to design this. And so a lot of times at COSIN conferences and things like that, I've gotten the question from various folks about how do we actually get in the room with the people, the educators making the decisions, and actually be seen as a strategic part of the conversation. And in the book, what we do is we lay out 4 different types of teams to tackle 4 different types of problems, to help district leaders really think about the scope of problem and who you need at the table to help solve it. And I'm not going to give the whole framework here for time's sake, but what I really want to emphasize is that I want you to be thinking in terms of that there are some problems that are relatively simple, for which honestly individual teachers or individual departments, or honestly with just some lightweight coordination between the tech department, say, and that individual teacher, they can solve that. And I see all too many districts, say, trying to increase the amount of time teachers might have to give rich feedback on writing assignments. Honestly, you can flip your classroom and achieve that. They bring a huge task force and huge layers of several different people to the table and create a lot of bureaucracy that just stifles the ability of the teacher to just simply make that change. The flip side, though, is also true. Sometimes we ask teachers to solve really big, meaty problems that require rethinking the architecture of the school, rethinking around how schedules will work, rethinking how assignments will be given out, what work is being done when. For that sort of change, you need a lot more people at the table. You guys need to be in that room helping them think through what are the implications from these various changes. Really helping think through device management, broadband capacity, data questions. These are really meaty things that you need a bigger group at the table for to solve these bigger architectural problems at the outset. And so I find that helping folks, district leaders, frame the level of problem that they're trying to solve, and then helps them think about who do they need to have a seat at the table to come to a successful design and solution, is a good way to start attacking that. It gives people a common language to think about who needs to be at the table from the outset, as opposed to sort of the we design in our silo, and then 24 hours before we hit go, we all of a sudden realize we need all of you and a bunch of others to come together to make it possible, and it's too late by then to pull it off. So that's the next step we talk about. And from there, once you've got the team in place to solve this meaty problem, then we say it's time to design the student experience. And when I talk about designing the student experience, I'm going to give you a framework in a moment from outside of education to think through this exercise. But the big idea that I want educators to start with is not to think about their current school with their current schedules as it currently exists. Come into this exercise thinking about how do we motivate students to want to be here, to learn? What are the set of experiences we think we need to provide them to accomplish our jobs, to meet our goals? And think about this from a blue sky, just anything is possible vantage point. Because as we go through the rest of the design process, reality is going to hit us many times over the head. But all too often as educators, we don't allow ourselves to dream of what's possible and just to think about what we might create if we started from scratch. And I think that's really, really important. And it starts really with thinking about this motivation question. What causes people to want to consume an experience? And for this, some of the research from innovation that we've done shows that in industry, actually, companies that we would think are really good at this are unbelievably actually terrible at this work. And so I want to just tell a story about how we tried to help solve that problem and think of a new way to understand motivation, and then we'll apply it into the education context. So apologies for stepping outside of education for about 5-10 minutes, but hopefully you'll see the relevance as we spin back. And this story emerges from this realization that 75% of new products and services that companies launch, well over 75% fail in the first year. Despite all the market research that they do, all the data that is now possible, the number has not budged really at all. Just over 3/4 of products and services that are new fail. And our sense is that one of the big reasons for this is that companies tend to segment the world by product category and customer demographic. So they'll have, for example, white males aged 35 to 49 with or without kids. And then they'll have product categories. So you have subcompact cars, compact cars, SUVs, minivans, on and on, right? And then they'll say that the average demographic of this white male aged 35 to 49 with kids, in my case, is most likely to buy minivan. And that happens to be true in my case. But putting that aside, often the thing is we don't actually conform to the average demographic, right, of the average that's expected to us. We just actually, we don't think of ourselves even as part of a demographic often, or part of a product category. We just have problems arise in our life, right? Things that we're trying to solve, and we hire products or services to help us solve those problems. So the on-average marketing world is unbelievably incapable of answering those types of questions. And just to give you a very quick anecdote of why that is, that world is able to see why one night my wife and I stay home and watch a movie on Netflix. And the next night we get a babysitter and we go out to the movie theater and watch a movie. And the on-average world of marketing just treats those both as movies, just the category movies. But what they don't understand is that fundamentally we're hiring those two experiences to do very different jobs in our lives, right? The second one being to get away from the kids and feel like adults again for a few minutes. And it's a very different set of experiences that you need to provide to get that experience done successfully from the first one where we simply are flicking on Netflix to watch a 30-minute show. And I'll give you a deeper story that emerged from the world of fast food and milkshakes in the 1990s. So there was a company in the 1990s that wanted to improve the sale of milkshakes. And they knew the average demographic most likely to buy a milkshake. And they knew what percentage of market share they had of milkshakes against Burger King, Wendy's, McDonald's, and so forth. And so they did what most people do when they have this problem. They called them the traditional marketing folks, and they did focus groups calling in the average demographic and said, how should we improve the sale of milkshakes? And they got very, very clear feedback. And they would make changes, and sales literally did not budge one bit. So they came back to this problem and brought in a different group from Detroit, Michigan in to help solve this problem. And they just asked themselves this simple question of, I wonder what job people are hiring a milkshake to do. But rather than ask the customers how to improve the milkshake, they just stood at the back of the restaurant one day for 18 hours and took copious notes of any time someone came in and bought a milkshake. What time of day was it? What were they wearing? What else did they buy? Were they with anyone else? Did they drink the milkshake in the restaurant or go out to their car slurping it down as they drove off? On and on and on. And at the end of the day, they saw a couple interesting things. 80% of milkshakes were sold at 2 times during the day. 50% of that was during the early morning rush hour commute. Kind of gross, right? No one said America was healthy. 30% were in the late afternoon, okay? Of the 50% group in the morning, every single one of them, same average demographic, by the way, every single one of them came in, bought a milkshake and nothing else. They were by themselves. Every single one of them went off to their car, drove off, slurping it down, okay? The next day, these guys that were doing the research, they stood outside the restaurant in the morning, and as these people came out with milkshake in hand, they confronted them. And in language that they would understand, they did not do an intervention. They instead asked them, tell me about what job you're trying to solve by hiring this milkshake. And the people looked at them sort of weirdly and said, that makes no sense. And they said, okay, think about the last time you were in this situation doing whatever it is you are doing right now. Tell me about that, and tell me what else you've bought in a similar situation. I said, I think I understand what you're saying. You see, I have this long rush hour commute to work right now, 30-minute drive or so in the car. I'm not starving now, but I know if I don't put something in my stomach, I'll be starving by 9:30. So it feels like I should be eating something, and it's that 30-minute commute gets boring. So I want to consume something that keeps me awake, keeps me excited, keeps me energized. So come to think of it, I hired bagels once. But take it from me, bagels don't do this job well at all because they're dry and tasteless. And the only way to make them taste good is if you spread cream cheese and jam on them, and then you start driving with your knees. And if the cell phone rings, man, you got major problems. I hired donuts once. But take it from me, donuts don't do this job well at all because you have to lie to your wife about them. And then it's not a terribly believable lie because when she got in the car later that evening to drive, she could immediately tell that I had been eating donuts because the steering wheel was completely gummy and sticky, and so she saw right through it. I hired bananas, but this was actually the worst thing of all because the stupid banana was gone in 30 seconds, so I was bored for the entire commute. And it wasn't very filling, so I was starving by maybe 9:45. But it turns out that when I come in here and hire this milkshake, it just does the job perfectly. Because I have no idea what they put in it, if it's healthy or not. I don't actually really care because it's so thick and viscous. It takes forever to suck up that tiny little straw that it easily lasts me my 30-minute drive to work. Again, no idea what they put in it, but it sinks to the bottom of my stomach, easily keeps me full till about 11:30 in the morning. And I have two hands, always used one on the steering wheel, the other on the microphone, and the other looking for, just sort of hung out, never knew what to do with it. And there turns out that there's this cup holder right here, and the milkshake just fits perfectly inside. So it turned out that the milkshake did the job better than its competitors, which weren't simply milkshakes from Burger King, Wendy's, McDonald's, and all that, but all of those things, plus bagels, donuts, coffee, Snickers bars, bananas, you name it, right? And so that the competition, if you will, was much larger for this job than they had realized. And the motivations for buying the milkshake were very different from what they understood. Now, in the late afternoon, it was the same average demographic coming into the restaurant to buy milkshakes, but they were coming in with their kids. And they would come in, they'd buy like a Happy Meal or the equivalent or whatever it was, and then the kid would give them a tug on the jacket and look up and say, "Dad, can't I have a milkshake?" And in this circumstance, you'd feel so bad for having said no all week long to your child for various other things, that you would say yes, essentially hiring the milkshake to feel like a good, patient father that was willing to give rewards to your kid. And this time you would sit down in the restaurant and you'd both eat your burgers and you'd finish it, and then, oh my God, he would start to drink the milkshake. And it would take forever to suck up that tiny little straw, this thick, viscous milkshake. And so you'd sit there waiting patiently because you hired it to feel like a good father, right? Or a good mother. And then you'd sit there waiting impatiently as he continued to try to chug this thing up. And then at some point you just say, "Son, we gotta go." And you take the half-consumed milkshake and you throw it in the trash can, you drag him out of the car, kicking and screaming, temper tantrum flaring, and you felt like a terrible parent. And so then you get called into the focus group and you get asked, "So, how should we improve milkshakes?" What do I tell you? I hired for two fundamentally different jobs that needs totally different things to get the job done. And when you average in all those responses together, you get a bunch of one-size-fits-none answers and a one-size-fits-none product. Now, let's start to turn this to education, and we'll go back and forth a little bit. But when we think about education, what are the jobs that students are trying to get done in their lives? It turns out school is not one of those jobs, right? That's not something that they are prioritizing. Their jobs look much more like, let's bring it up, that they want to experience success and make progress on a daily basis, and they want to have fun with their friends, okay, for the most part. And it turns out school does a pretty lousy job delivering on both of these jobs, because the opportunities to experience success and really feel meaningful progress occur, say, every 3 to 4 weeks when there's a test. And a lot of the tests are graded on a curve to actually make you feel like a failure. And then sometimes we give opportunity to feel successful in extracurricular activities like arts, music, sports, and so forth, but we call them extracurricular. We separate them from the core academics, right? Similarly, you think about how you can move to a competency-based learning system how that would change that equation, where you would actually be getting assessments every single day, basically, and constantly getting feedback, able to deliver content at just the right point in time so that you could advance and feel that success constantly as part of your learning experience. Or the other piece of it is to have fun with friends. At least in my schooling experience, it was dominated by teachers telling me to stop having fun with my friends in class. And the opportunities to have fun with friends were, again, in those extracurricular activities or lunchtime or so forth. Contrast this with the opportunity to bring in project-based learning, maker spaces and the like. We can actually really embed the opportunities to experience success and make progress and have fun with friends as part of that educational experience, as opposed to a side thing. But the funny thing is, as school is currently structured, it's actually competing with a lot of other things for students' time, right, where they want to spend their time. Because there are lots of other activities in their lives that they can hire, in essence, to help them experience success, make progress, or have fun with friends. From athletics, arts, music, etc., to video games, to gangs, to dropping out and cruising around town and feeling like, you know, you're on top of the world. There are lots of things that schools are competing with that we don't acknowledge in terms of competing for students' times. And so understanding this would say, gosh, we really need to rethink the design of education, not just to get students' jobs to be done, but so that we can get them done, so that we can get our jobs done as educators to successfully prepare them for the world in which they're entering. And so as you think about how to nail a job, basically, there's 3 levels or layers in any given job. The first one is fundamentally, what's that fundamental job to be done? And every job has a functional, social, and emotional dimension to it. And from there, the next level is, what are the experiences in purchase or in use that we need to provide to really get that job done perfectly? So if you think about that morning rush hour commute job, should we make the milkshake thicker or thinner? How should we talk about advertising it? How do we help people consume it? Do we have it in the right cup, etc.? Things like that. What are the experiences that we need to provide to help people get this job? And then what do we need to provide, and how do we have to integrate it together to deliver on those experiences that deliver on the job? So the restaurant, for example, thought that they were well integrated along the, in terms of delivering milkshakes, right? They had the dispensing machine in the back that would mix up the ingredients, dispense the milkshake, and deliver it to the customers. But understanding the morning rush hour job, you'd actually want to move that machine to the front of the line, give people a prepaid swipe card so they can just dash in, gas up, and get on their way, right? Very different architecture. You would make the milkshake thicker, actually, because you want to be sure that it lasts them during that 30-minute commute. And you'd stir in tiny fruit chunks, not to make it healthy, because they were pretty explicit that they do not care about whether it was healthy or not. They would not be drinking a milkshake in the first place if they cared about the health thing. But instead, so that it would enliven the experience and keep it and help fight boredom during the commute. So you'd be driving along every once in a while and swallow a piece of fruit, and gee, that was interesting. True story. Go to Jamba Juice and check it out. But this is, right, understanding this gives you different insights. And so as we turn to education, I just want to give you one case study about a school in the Bay Area in California, and now operating 2 schools actually in the state of Washington, that I think has been extremely thoughtful about understanding student motivations and jobs and architecting accordingly. And it's called Summit Public Schools. And their job, if you will, their goal for students is, how do we help students achieve lifelong success? And from their perspective, that means instilling these 4 domains in every student, okay? So content knowledge, absolutely critical, habits of success, experiences outside of school so students can discover their passions, have a real reason to actually commit to their studies, and then cognitive skills, okay? This is what they frame as they have to deliver for students. But to get students' jobs to be done, accomplished, they have to architect a very different schooling experience. And from my read of it, Summit provides at least 8 experiences to help get done this student success and have fun with friends jobs. So the first one is student agency, starting to give students ownership over their own progress so that they can actually get a clearer feedback into the success metric. The second one is individual mastery. Students only move on upon truly mastering material, which again embeds that success and progress. Third, access to actionable data and rapid feedback. Okay, again, along that progress success. Transparency and learning goals. They don't just put what we're going to do over the course of a semester out there. They put forth every single competency and learning goal you're going to have to accomplish over the 4 years of your high school experience to get to graduation. They make that very transparent. The game is totally clear to every single student, regardless of background, at the beginning and constantly. The fifth one was they said our particular students come from populations where they don't always have the ability to carve out time to just read. And so we need to actually, in the school day, provide sustained periods of quiet, solitary reading time so that they can be successful. 6, 7, and 8 have to do with both the have fun with friends and the success. So meaningful work experience. 7th was mentoring experiences. So again, opportunities for fun with friends, but also building on success. And positive group experiences. These were the 8 experiences that Summit decided that they needed to provide. And to deliver on that, they had to figure out what do we need to offer and how do we have to integrate it together. And so the first thing was they offer individual playlists. They've worked with Facebook to create what they call the PLP, personalized learning playlists or platform, I can never remember, but basically they offer it actually for free to all districts through their Basecamp program, such that you can use it, and every student has several different pathways through which they can master different competencies, okay? So it starts to build in student agency. Every single student goes through this learning cycle every single day and week, where they have 16 hours a week of personalized learning time where they are choosing how they are mastering the competencies through this platform, this playlists, and they are setting goals, they're planning how they're going to achieve those goals, they're learning, then they're showing evidence that they have learned, reflecting on the experience and repeating that cycle. Really starts to build that agency opportunities, and it's constantly embedding that success cycle. Comprehensive scope and sequence through graduation, made transparent through the platform, rich, transparent feedback on writing assignments and so forth so that students can do something about it and keep improving performance so that they can keep realizing success and make progress. This is a schedule, a day in the life of a Summit student. It doesn't look anything like the 7-period day that we typically have or block schedule. Students start with project time in the morning, then they have dedicated personalized learning time, an hour a day, except for Fridays where most of the day is dedicated to this personalized learning time, working through the computer playlists. And then you see there's a sustained period of quiet, solitary reading time in the day, and then huge chunks of project-based learning time in the afternoon. And on Fridays, while students are doing the personalized learning time on their own, they're working with mentors in very clear patterns so that every single week at least, they are connecting with their mentor, their teacher in the school for at least a block of a conference to really think about the goals, how things are going in their life, broader than just a school. And then 8 weeks per year, students get off campus and into externships and internships into the community as part of school so that they can build relationships with people outside of the community and start to understand why school is important and connected toward that success goal. And then, the other thing that this really creates that's very cool is that it creates 8 weeks per year when teachers get professional development to be enhancing this experience. Really neat feedback opportunity for the teachers as well to be constantly improving their craft. So that's just one example. It's not the end-all be-all by any means, but an example of how to really be thinking about the design of the student experience through this jobs lens. From there, you start to think about what does the ideal teaching experience look like? And what I would just push on people is that as you're thinking about this question, a really critical one is to ask what's the best use of face-to-face time? And I would submit that doing what I'm doing right now is probably not it. Lecturing just increasingly makes less and less sense, right? And so, because we can use the computer for these things in the online learning, instead shifting that teacher role to really mentor students, facilitate rich Socratic discussions or projects, tutor students in small groups or one-on-one where they need it, spend time evaluating student work in much richer ways. And as you think about that early example from Western Governors University, connecting it to some of the opportunities in this new world for evaluating rich, robust, performance-based tasks. And then counselor I put up here as well, just this sense that a lot of students struggle not because of academic problems, but because of all the non-academic things that are going on in their lives, from family structures to their health and ability to get nourishment and things like that. And really freeing up teachers to understand those challenges, help adjust school accordingly so that they can succeed. And then what we're seeing is blended learning schools right now across the country are doing lots of things to take this on, but also understand what teachers' jobs to be done are and build opportunities for them to really be motivated in their own teaching craft. And so from extending the reach of great teachers through master teacher formulations, allowing teachers to specialize. Some teachers love to geek out on data. Others don't want to touch and would much rather be working one-on-one or in a small group with a student. Team teaching, and I don't mean just like, gee, we have a group of sixth grade teachers that we think of as a team, but really tearing down the walls between classrooms and allowing them to collaborate and bounce off each other as a team in real time. Awards for achievement, so basically we're seeing a school shift from continuing education as something that happens 3-4 times a year in professional development days to something that is just-in-time professional development all the time, and teachers are getting awards for actually mastering different crafts or for the work that they do with students in the classroom, and then granting authority, giving teachers more and more opportunities to actually design these environments in the future, work directly with all of you to create these experiences. From there, so we've done a lot of things, and we literally have not talked about technology much at all, or software or anything, and that's intentional, because now we sort of have this idealized environment of what we want education to look like, and this is where we start to dive into the brass tacks of how do we actually implement and operationalize this vision. And this is also where reality hits pretty hard, and we have to come back to earth, and we can't get everything we want. But this is where we start to think about the content, the technology, the facilities design, and so forth to actually realize this. And I just thought I would talk about a couple things from the book, just as for what they're worth to help you out if it's useful in terms of frameworks about thinking about some of these decisions just at a high level. This is just 12 considerations that we've found useful to help districts when they're picking software to align against those instructional goals and designs that they've created. From what do you already have existing inventory to do you need full-time direct instruction content versus supplemental exercise instruction? How adaptive or assignable do you want it? Meaning, do you want the software just making its decisions on its own through its own black box algorithm? Or do you want to give teachers the ability to dive in and actually assign particular student content to particular individual students, things like that? Where does the control live? What's the alignment with your curriculum, provisioning questions, single sign-on, things like that, that I think you ought to be asking vendors about how they fall out on these set of criteria based on your particular instructional goals. And depending on staffing, goals, design, you're gonna come out to different answers of what you value in this list, but hopefully it's useful. And then the other thing I thought I would do, a piece from our research on disruptive innovation to think through some of the questions about what architectures do you commit to from a perspective of as you're making hardware and software and operating system choices across the district. And this is basically the disruptive innovation diagram where we see the blue and green lines representing technologies improving faster than people's lives change. And what we see in the beginning of most industries is that the early products and services tend to be very proprietary and interdependent, right? That is, the way one part works and functions depend upon the way another part works and functions, and vice versa. And the reason for this is that the way these parts interact is very unpredictably interdependent. We're not sure if we make a change in one part of the architecture, what that will do to the rest of the system. And so if we want to make the early products and services good enough to gain usage in the market, we have to wrap our hands around the whole problem and design it from a whole holistic perspective. And so IBM mainframes in the 1950s, IBM probably wasn't dying to fully integrate around not just building and selling computers, but also designing the logic circuitry and the core memory, and actually literally designing and building every single aspect of a computer initially, but it was the only way to get it done if they wanted to make it good enough. Microsoft Windows is another example of a very integrally interdependent architecture. And as you all know, I don't need to tell you, but if you were to go in and say, I want a customized version of Microsoft Windows, and I'm just going to delete this 10 lines of code that I don't particularly like, it would screw up the way the entire operating system would work, such that it would crash, and not just because it was Windows. Apologies if Microsoft is here, but because those 10 lines of code, in very seriousness, interact in very intricately interdependent ways with the rest of the code, right? And so Microsoft Windows, as a result, is able to optimize and give a very high quality experience, but there's a trade-off. Customizing in that architecture would cost you in excess of $500 million to get a custom-made version of Microsoft Windows for your instance, right? And you contrast this with a modular architecture where the performance now is satisfying the basic criteria, and what you start to want is actually more responsiveness to customization, speed, and the ability to adapt and shift product architectures and so forth. And you get a very different modular architecture where different parts fit together in very standards-based ways, such that you can just plug and play and mix and match different best-of-breed components. And in these systems, well, I'll give some examples. Like Dell personal computers from the 1990s were a classic case where you peeled off the cover of a Dell computer, they didn't make any of the parts inside, right? And what that enabled you to do, because those parts fit together in very well understood ways, is you could go on the Dell website, I believe Dell is here and the Dell Foundation is here, of course, and you could just very quickly order a custom configured Dell computer where you'd say, I want this much memory in my Seagate drive, I want this type of monitor, this type of processor from Intel, on and on and on. They'd very quickly custom assemble these parts and ship out within 24, 48 hours a very affordable computer, right? So the world is always toggling back and forth between these different architectures based on where we sit as consumers. And so as you think about content, this obviously has huge implications for thinking about hardware, from whether you want an Apple system, which is the most integrated system, versus say Google Chrome on the other end, which is much more modular. But it also has implications for software itself. And what you saw was that it's following the same pattern, where in the early 1990s, mid 1990s, when online learning got started, every district and school had to follow a do-it-yourself, DIY strategy, where they were building their own content because it had to be good enough just to work, function, and align with their individual standards, their students within the district. And that's a great strategy for optimizing alignment to your particular students, your particular curricular and standards needs. But of course, there's a huge cost, because as technology is rapidly improving, changing technology, features are rapidly improving, to keep up with that pace of improvement and compete with all the vendors who are spending massive amounts of dollars on R&D on their products is very difficult. And so you're starting to see strategy 2 really in the early 2000s became the dominant one, which was to use one outside provider. We're just going to use one course provider to provide this course. And that works pretty well along certain continuum, but then you start to hear districts be frustrated that I can't customize the course to my particular needs. It doesn't have, say, the Washington State history standards or Oregon State history standards. We need to be able to customize this, or it doesn't meet this particular student's needs. And the reality of the situation is there is no one perfect software in the world. It just does not exist. And so you're seeing a lot of districts work with companies like Education Elements to cobble together multiple providers. So for math, they might use Dreambox Learning and ST Math and Zern to create a holistic blended experience that can meet different students with different needs, just as a hypothetical. And they're cobbling these different providers together to work. It starts to give them customization in that they can provide more tailored experiences to their student population. But the trade-off right now of taking proprietary vendors that don't actually want their standards to talk to each other is that teachers all the time are complaining that the data doesn't work underlying it. That these systems don't actually talk to each other. And so the data I get from ST Math, literally I have no idea how it relates to Dreambox Learning, and I have no idea what to do with that information. And so we're in this period right now where I think we're starting to transition into strategy 4, which I think will be the future of a lot of this content business, which is we'll get content from what we call a facilitated network platform, where the platform, the standards both of the of how the content is indexed and found and instantiated and created, as well as the assessments, live inside of that platform itself, and that you pull down different content modules or different providers start writing for these facilitated networks because they want to be part of the network that's gaining usage to use this. And I think you're seeing lots of people try to compete to be this facilitated network platform right now, from adaptive learning companies like Newton, Khan Academy, even the PLP from Summit is playing this game. Guru, there's many groups right now who are trying to play this game, and it's still early and not quite good enough for a lot of people. So we're sort of in this weird zone where we've got these 4 strategies all in play, and none is quite satisfactory. And so I just think about these trade-offs as you're making decisions with your districts and designing and choosing the content strategy that makes sense for the right application. And what I would say is you're probably going to be cobbling together several different of these strategies depending on the particular course, goals, design that you've come up with, and so forth. I'm going to wrap up in the next couple minutes, but the last part of this step is thinking about the facilities. And the big question I'd love you to be asking as you're working with your educators is, what's the best use of brick and mortar space? And I'd submit traditional classrooms increasingly are not going to be the right example for this. And we're going to start thinking about spaces that are certainly safe, clean, and inspiring. Those are sort of the table stakes to get into the conversation. But really thinking about spaces that are available, provide flexible use for different particular modalities and things like that, that look very different. And I just thought I'd put up a screenshot from Intrinsic Schools, which is a school in Chicago, Illinois, that is new, cost 1/3 of the cost of a traditional school in Chicago, with far more instructional square footage, by really rethinking what space should look like in a blended learning school. And making very conscious efforts to avoid the open classroom mistakes from the 1960s and 70s, which we can talk about in the Q&A session later this afternoon if anyone's interested. But you can see that they have very dedicated spaces to very different learning modalities that occur, and a lot of thought in that as they constructed that experience. And I live outside of Boston right now, where in Lexington, where we just passed a school bond measure that I'm terrified by, because we're going to be just adding very traditional classrooms to our very traditional 20th century mausoleums to the past. And I just think we really need to be thinking about how this interacts with where we're trying to go from an education perspective. From there, you lock in your instructional model after you've gone through this design process, and there's lots of different ways to do blended learning. For time's sake, I'm going to sort of whip through this right now, and you can get all this at the Blended Learning Universe, blendedlearning.org. It's all free up there if you want to learn more about it. But station rotation models, where students are rotating among different stations. Lab, this is what it looks like in a 5th grade classroom, in a kindergarten classroom in Los Angeles, California. Lab rotation, where students are rotating out to a lab in a very repeated pattern. Flipped classroom, that I suspect many of you have heard of. Individual rotation model, where similarly students are rotating to different modalities, but they each have an individualized playlist of what they rotate through on any given day, and teachers get to spend a lot more time working one-on-one with students as a result. A flex model, which you'll see very popular in a lot of the credit recovery and dropout recovery schools that and models that have proliferated across, But really, teachers are absolutely critical in these flex models, which I think has sometimes been forgotten and reduced the quality. And you can see this is the Summit Public Schools actually, what it looks like, that flex model. It looks like pretty cool organized chaos, and they have a lot of fun with it. The a la carte model, where you're taking one online course with a virtual teacher, but it's blended into the rest of your school experience. This is, I think, of the ubiquitous form of blended learning in many high schools, that many high schools are offering online courses for particular students in particular cases. Just one note on this, which is that the research is increasingly showing that students who have an on-site mentor, even if that person is not the teacher of record, do far, far, far better than students who are just left to their own devices to work with a virtual teacher with no on-site mentor. So creating spaces where there's cyber lounge, librarians, or particular specific subject matter generalists who are around to help students, really, really important part of this. And then the enriched virtual model, which really has its roots in the full-time virtual schools, the first of which actually started in Washington State. But realizing that actually having touch points with a given rhythm every single week, where students actually come in and work with their peers and teachers in face-to-face, is important for many students. So we see that proliferating. From there, shaping the culture, and the one line I'll just say on this is, blended learning will accelerate a good culture and make it great. It will also accelerate a bad culture and make it terrible. And the reason I say that is you are giving a lot more autonomy to students over their learning over time. They have to make a lot more decisions. If you haven't set in place the culture of expectations and how processes and priorities should play out, that can go either way. And there's plenty of bad stories, and there's plenty of amazing stories of being really thoughtful about what does culture look like as we move into these blended learning environments. And then from there, I would say, don't assume that whatever model you've come up with at the end of the design process is the final model. Really enter a discovery-driven planning process where you identify and prioritize the assumptions you're making that have to prove true to hit that SMART goal and be successful, and then test and learn. Figure out the quickest ways to just test if your assumptions are correct, and then as they prove true, start to double down. When assumptions are wrong, adjust the model. And don't do this just every year once we have summative test data, but figure out ways to do really quick burst tests that take a day, an hour of talking to a neighboring district that did something interesting, et cetera, just so we can really improve and quicken the cycle time of making these adjustments in these models to really make some breakthrough leaps forward. I personally, again, think we're just standing at this unbelievable time in the history of education, in this country. With online learning maturing the way it has, with the energy from educators to blend it in their schools the way that they have, with a very new policy environment, as I said again at the beginning, of the Every Student Succeeds Act, that opens up the possibilities to think through what would competency-based learning look like, what would new systems of assessments look like. It really is empowering you and all the fellow educators to take this period of time to step back and think, what do we want schooling to look like, and then go design that future. And so the question, I think, to will we fulfill the potential of this moment in an exciting way, and I think we would want it no other way, rests with all of you in this room, which is what's so exciting. And I'm excited that you spent an hour of your day with me today. I'll be around for a Q&A session later in the afternoon where we can keep diving into this. But seriously, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for the commitment that you show every single day for the future of this country, the future of the world, our students. Thank you very much.